As the golden sunset casts long shadows, Duke, the courageous K9, finds himself surrounded by a ruthless biker gang. Just when all hope seems lost, a figure emerges from the shadows. Jack Turner, Duke's handler and loyal partner, steps forward, calm and ready to face the danger. But what's really behind this attack? A dark conspiracy begins to unfold, one they never saw coming. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. The golden hues of the setting sun stretched across the empty highway, broken only by the roar of motorcycles. In the center of a circle formed by the notorious biker gang, did Razor Riders lay Duke, a canine German shepherd, his fur smeared with dirt and streaks of blood. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his sharp eyes never lost their focus. Despite the pain coursing through him, Duke's training and unshakable spirit kept him standing. Even as the gang jeered and taunted him, across the road, hidden in the dry brush, Jack Turner, Duke's handler, watched intently. A former military veteran turned field agent, Jack was known for his calm demeanor under pressure. But this time, rage simmered beneath his calculated exterior. Duke wasn't just a partner, he was family. Every second Jack waited felt like a lifetime, but he knew he couldn't act recklessly. His mind raced, searching for the perfect moment to rescue his loyal companion without putting him in greater danger. The bikers, drunk on their perceived dominance, paid no attention to their surroundings. One of them, a burly man with tattoos snaking down his arms, stepped closer to Duke, swinging a heavy chain in his hand. The dog, though battered, let out a low growl, standing his ground as a final act of defiance. The gang erupted into laughter, their arrogance blinding them to the storm that was brewing just out of sight. Jack took a deep breath, steadied his grip on the situation, and emerged from the shadows. His voice, cold and commanding, cut through the bikers' laughter like a knife. "Step away from him," he said, his tone brooking no argument. The gang turned, momentarily stunned by his presence. Duke, hearing the familiar voice of his handler, pushed through his pain and dragged himself to Jack's side. The sight of the battered dog standing loyally by his trainer sent a clear message. This fight was far from over. The bikers hesitated, the balance of power shifting as Jack and Duke stood together. Faced with an adversary whose determination they underestimated, the gang began to back away, muttering curses and promises of revenge. Jack didn't flinch, his focus solely on Duke. Kneeling beside the dog, he carefully examined his injuries. "You're tougher than all of them combined," he murmured, his voice softer now, filled with both relief and pride. As Jack prepared to carry Duke to safety, a glint of metal on the ground caught his eye. He reached down and picked up a small, unassuming object left behind by the bikers. Turning it over in his hand, he realized it might hold answers or lead to even greater dangers. The battle for Duke's life had been won, but as Jack looked at the object, he knew this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. This was just the beginning of an incredible story of loyalty and courage. Leave a like to support us and subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters of this thrilling journey. The faint hum of sirens echoed in the distance as Jack carried Duke to the safety of his truck. The dog's breath was shallow, his once powerful frame now limp in Jack's arms. Carefully placing him in the back seat, Jack grabbed a first aid kit and began tending to the wounds. Duke flinched as the antiseptic stung, but his eyes stayed locked on Jack, a silent exchange of trust passing between them. "Hang in there, buddy," Jack whispered, his voice steady, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his worry. As Jack worked to stabilize Duke, his mind kept circling back to the small, metallic object he had picked up earlier. It was a USB drive, seemingly left behind on purpose by one of the bikers. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a careless mistake. The gang had been too deliberate, too confident during their ambush. Sliding the drive into his pocket, he decided he would investigate it as soon as Duke was stable. First things first, his partner came before everything else. Arriving at the nearest emergency vet clinic, Jack rushed inside with Duke in his arms. The staff sprang into action, guiding him to a treatment room. While the veterinarians examined Duke, Jack paced the waiting area, the USB drive weighing heavily in his hand. Every second without Duke felt like an eternity, but Jack's mind couldn't rest. The Razor Riders weren't just a group of troublemakers. They were organized, and they had been targeting something or someone specific. After what felt like hours, the vet emerged, assuring Jack that Duke would recover, but would need rest and further care. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. As Jack sat beside Duke, who now rested on a padded table, his thoughts turned back to the bikers. Why had they been so focused on taking Duke out of the picture? His instincts screamed that this was bigger than a simple ambush, and the USB drive might hold the answers he needed. Back in his truck, Jack inserted the drive into his laptop, half expecting it to be empty or corrupted. Instead, a series of files opened, revealing detailed information on weapon shipments, coded messages, and most disturbingly, surveillance photos of Duke and Jack during previous missions. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a random encounter. The Razor Riders had been tracking them for weeks, maybe months. Jack's pulse quickened as he scrolled through the files, each discovery raising more questions than answers. As the weight of the situation sank in, Jack glanced back at Duke, who stirred slightly but remained quiet. "Looks like we've stumbled into something big, partner," he murmured. Determined, Jack started the truck and drove toward a safe house. He knew they needed to regroup and figure out their next move. But one thing was clear: this wasn't over. The Razor Riders had made it personal, and Jack was ready to face whatever came next. The safe house was tucked away in the woods, far from prying eyes. Jack pulled into the gravel driveway, stepping out to survey the quiet surroundings. He carried Duke inside, gently placing him on a cushioned mat near the fireplace. The dog let out a soft whine, his injuries still fresh, but his gaze remained focused on Jack. "You're tough, Duke. We'll get through this," Jack said, patting his partner's head before turning to his laptop. He had no time to waste. The information on the USB drive demanded his full attention. Sitting at the old wooden table, Jack reopened the files. The surveillance photos made his skin crawl. The bikers had been watching him and Duke during missions, even capturing moments outside their operations. But what caught his eye next was a list of names, each one tied to high-profile individuals. Politicians, law enforcement officers, and private contractors were all listed with coded notes beside their names. Jack quickly realized the gang wasn't working alone. They were part of a larger network, one that extended far beyond the roads they terrorized. One name, however, stood out: Brandon Knight, a former military operative turned private security consultant. Jack recognized the name instantly. Knight had once been a trusted ally during their military days, but rumors of his involvement in shady dealings had ended his career. Seeing Knight's name connected to the Razor Riders sent a chill down Jack's spine. If Knight was involved, it meant the gang's operations weren't just about smuggling weapons. They were part of something much more dangerous. As Jack pieced together the information, his thoughts were interrupted by a low growl from Duke. The dog struggled to sit up. His ears perked toward the door. Jack immediately grabbed his sidearm, his instincts kicking in. He moved silently to the window, peering out into the darkness. The faint sound of motorcycles in the distance confirmed his suspicions. They had been followed. "They don't waste any time, do they?" Jack muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. He quickly assessed the situation, locking the doors and securing the windows. Duke, though still weak, stood on shaky legs, his posture alert. Jack couldn't help but feel a surge of pride at his partner's resilience. "We've got this, Duke," he said, crouching next to the dog and giving him a reassuring pat. But deep down, he knew they were outnumbered. The Razor Riders weren't coming to talk. They were here to finish what they started. As the sound of engines grew louder, Jack positioned himself by the door, his mind racing with plans. The safe house was stocked with emergency supplies and enough firepower to hold off an attack. But this wasn't just about survival. Jack needed answers, and he wasn't going to let the bikers leave without giving them. With Duke by his side, even injured, Jack knew they stood a chance. "Let's show them who they're messing with," he said under his breath, as the first set of headlights pierced through the darkness. The roar of motorcycle engines grew deafening as the Razor Riders rolled into view, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Jack watched from the window, his breath steady as he counted the figures dismounting their bikes. 7 men, heavily armed and moving with purpose, spread out around the perimeter. They weren't taking any chances this time. Jack glanced at Duke, who was still standing despite his injuries. "We've been through worse, haven't we, buddy?" he said, giving the dog a nod of reassurance before moving to secure his position. The safe house wasn't much, but it had been built with defense in mind. Reinforced doors, bullet-resistant windows, and a small armory in the basement gave Jack a fighting chance. He quickly grabbed a tactical shotgun and a set of flashbangs, knowing he couldn't rely on brute force alone. Strategy and timing would be key. Duke, sensing the tension, limped to the doorway and positioned himself beside Jack, his growl low but steady. Even injured, Duke was ready to defend his handler. Outside, the gang's leader, a burly man with a patch-reading stone, barked orders to his crew. "Flush him out. This ends tonight," he shouted. Two of the bikers approached the front of the house cautiously, their weapons drawn. Jack waited, his heart pounding in sync with the ticking seconds. As one of the men moved to kick in the door, Jack pulled the pin on a flashbang and tossed it out a side window. The explosion of light and sound sent the bikers reeling, buying him precious seconds to act. Jack moved swiftly, his years of military training taking over. He flanked the bikers from the side entrance, disarming one with a precise strike before taking cover behind a stack of firewood. The second man turned, firing wildly, but his shots went wide. Jack returned fire, hitting the biker's weapon and forcing him to retreat. From inside, Duke barked sharply, his instincts driving him to protect Jack despite his weakened state. As the chaos unfolded, Marcus and the remaining bikers regrouped, realizing they had underestimated their target. Marcus's face twisted in frustration as he shouted, "You're only delaying the inevitable. Turner, we know what you've got and we're taking it." Jack clenched his jaw, now certain the USB drive was their true objective. He needed to find a way to neutralize the threat without destroying the crucial evidence in his possession. Jack retreated into the house, regrouping with Duke as the bikers began a more coordinated assault. He knelt beside his partner, placing a reassuring hand on the dog's head. "This isn't over, but we're not going down without a fight," he said firmly. The sound of boots approaching the porch signaled the next wave of the attack. Jack adjusted his grip on the shotgun, his eyes narrowing with resolve. Whatever happened next, he and Duke would face it together, proving once again that their bond was unbreakable. The night had grown colder, the tension in the air palpable as Jack positioned himself near the barricaded front door. The bikers were regrouping, their movements more coordinated now. He could hear them shouting orders to surround the house. The situation was dire, but Jack's mind was laser-focused. He glanced at Duke, who lay by his side, ears perked and eyes sharp despite his injuries. "This isn't just about us anymore, buddy," Jack murmured. "They're after something bigger, and we can't let them win." From the shadows outside, a sharp whistle pierced the night, followed by the sound of glass shattering. One of the bikers had thrown a Molotov cocktail through a side window, flames licking up the wooden walls of the safe house. Jack sprang into action, grabbing a fire extinguisher and dousing the flames before they could spread. The attack had begun in earnest. The bikers were testing his defenses, trying to force him into the open, but Jack knew better than to play by their rules. He retreated to the second floor where he had a clear view of the surrounding area. Through the scope of his rifle, he saw Marcus directing the assault. The gang leader was shouting into a radio, likely coordinating with someone outside the immediate scene. Jack's suspicion deepened. This wasn't just a local gang with a vendetta. They were part of a larger network, and Marcus was only a cog in the machine. Jack adjusted his aim, but hesitated. Taking out Marcus might stop the immediate threat, but it wouldn't give him the answers he needed. Duke let out a warning bark, snapping Jack out of his thoughts. Two bikers had managed to breach the back entrance, their footsteps echoing up the staircase. Jack moved quickly, setting a trap with a flashbang. The explosion disoriented the intruders, giving him just enough time to neutralize them. Duke limped to Jack's side, his growl low but fierce. "Good boy," Jack said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The bond between them was unshakable, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the bikers outside regrouped, Marcus's voice rang out again. "Turner, we know you have the drive. Hand it over and this ends now." Jack tightened his grip on his weapon, his mind racing. He knew the information on the USB drive was crucial, but he also realized he couldn't fight off the gang forever. He needed a plan to escape with Duke and the evidence intact. Time was running out, and every second brought the bikers closer to overwhelming his defenses. Jack's eyes darted to the underground escape hatch hidden beneath the floorboards. It was a risky move, but it might be their only chance. He knelt beside Duke, stroking the dog's head gently. "We're getting out of here, but I need you to stay strong for just a little longer," he whispered. Duke's ears twitched, his loyalty shining through his tired eyes. With determination, Jack prepared to execute his escape plan, knowing that the battle outside was just the beginning of a much larger war. What did you think of this action-packed chapter? Comment below. Your opinion is essential for us to keep creating exciting stories like this. Let's talk about Jack, Duke, and what's coming next. The air in the safe house was thick with tension as Jack lifted the hidden floorboard, revealing the narrow escape tunnel beneath. It was an ideal, dark, cramped, and barely wide enough for a man and a Duke, but it was their best shot at survival. Duke stood by Jack's side, his breathing heavy but steady. "We've got to move fast." "Partner," Jack said softly, gripping the USB drive tightly in one hand and securing his weapon in the other. Outside, Marcus and his gang were closing in. The sound of boots crunching on gravel and murmured commands told Jack they were preparing for a final push. He could hear Marcus barking orders. "Flush him out. Tear the place apart if you have to." Jack lowered himself into the tunnel first, gesturing for Duke to follow. The dog hesitated for a moment, his instincts warning him of the confined space. But with a soft command from Jack, he climbed down, his loyalty outweighing his fear. The tunnel stretched far beneath the property, reinforced with wooden beams but barely lit by the dim light of Jack's flashlight. Each step was careful and deliberate, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Duke limped behind, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Above them, muffled crashes echoed as the gang began breaking into the house, their frustration evident. Jack felt the urgency rising, knowing they only had minutes before the bikers realized he was no longer inside. Halfway through the tunnel, Jack paused as a faint vibration rattled the walls. He froze, holding his breath as the sound of footsteps approached from the far end of the passage. The Razor Riders had anticipated his move. "They're smarter than I gave them credit for," Jack muttered under his breath. He quickly extinguished the flashlight and pressed his back against the wall, pulling Duke close. The darkness enveloped them, forcing Jack to rely on his training and instinct. As the footsteps drew nearer, Jack could make out faint voices. "He's got to be down here," one of them said. "Marcus wants that drive no matter what." Jack tightened his grip on his weapon, his pulse steady despite the tension. When the first biker's silhouette appeared at the edge of the tunnel, Jack acted quickly, taking him out with a silent but precise strike. The second biker turned in surprise, but Duke lunged forward, his instincts overriding his injuries, and brought the man down. Jack knelt beside the dog, whispering, "Good work, Duke. Let's keep moving." With the immediate threat neutralized, Jack and Duke pushed forward, emerging at the end of the tunnel into a wooded area behind the safe house. The cold night air hit them like a shock, but it also brought relief. They were one step ahead for now. Jack scanned the area, his mind already formulating their next move. He knew this wasn't over. The gang wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But as he looked at Duke, battered but standing tall, Jack felt a surge of determination. They'd make it through this together. The dense woods offered Jack and Duke a temporary refuge as they moved cautiously through the shadows. The faint hum of motorcycles in the distance reminded Jack that the gang wouldn't give up easily. He kept one hand on his weapon and the other steadying Duke, whose limp was becoming more pronounced. "Just a little farther," Jack whispered, scanning the dark forest for any signs of movement. His breath formed clouds in the crisp night air, each step carefully placed to avoid noise. Reaching a small clearing, Jack knelt beside Duke to check his injuries. The dog was exhausted, his body trembling from both pain and exertion. Jack gently ran his hand over Duke's side, inspecting the worst of the wounds. "You've done more than enough, partner," he said quietly, his voice carrying both gratitude and concern. But even in his weakened state, Duke's eyes burned with loyalty, a silent promise that he wouldn't stop until Jack was safe. Jack pulled out his map, using the dim moonlight to pinpoint their location. A safe haven was still miles away, but the nearest option was an abandoned ranger station he had used once during a training mission. It wasn't ideal, but it would provide some cover. Folding the map, Jack decided they'd head there, knowing it was their best chance to regroup. As he stood, the faint sound of voices carried through the trees, sending a chill down his spine. The gang was closer than he'd hoped. Pushing forward, Jack guided Duke through the underbrush, their movement silent but swift. The forest seemed endless, every rustling leaf and snapping twig amplifying the tension. Suddenly, a beam of light swept across the trees behind them, followed by a gruff voice. "They're close, spread out." Jack ducked low, pulling Duke with him as the light passed overhead. The Razor Riders were combing the area, and their numbers were too great to confront head-on. Jack's mind raced as he weighed his options. A direct fight would be suicide, but evasion was growing increasingly difficult. Then he spotted a shallow ravine up ahead, partially hidden by thick brush. It was risky, but it could buy them time. "Come on, Duke," Jack murmured, helping the dog navigate the steep descent. They slid down into the ravine, crouching behind a large rock as the gang's footsteps grew louder above them. Duke's breathing was heavy, but he stayed silent, his training kicking in even under immense strain. As the footsteps passed overhead, Jack allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. He looked at Duke, who was leaning against him, tired but resolute. "We're not out of this yet, but we'll make it," he said softly, gripping the USB drive in his pocket. He knew the Razor Riders wouldn't stop hunting them, but he also knew he had something they desperately wanted, and that gave him leverage. For now, survival was the priority, but Jack was already planning his next move. He wasn't just going to run, he was going to fight back. The abandoned ranger station loomed ahead, its weathered frame barely visible in the pale moonlight. Jack pushed the door open cautiously, the creak echoing in the stillness. Inside, dust blanketed the old wooden floors, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. It wasn't much, but it was a defensible spot. "We'll rest here for a while," Jack said, guiding Duke inside. The dog, clearly exhausted, sank to the floor with a soft grunt, his chest rising and falling heavily. Jack quickly assessed the space, checking for weak points and barricading the doors with whatever he could find. He discovered a rusted metal cabinet and some heavy chairs, enough to create a makeshift barrier. From the window, he could see faint lights moving through the forest, evidence that the gang was still searching. Time was running out, but Jack knew Duke needed a break. He crouched beside the dog, offering him water from a canteen. "You've done enough for now. Rest," he whispered, his voice softer than usual. As Duke drifted into a light sleep, Jack turned his attention to the USB drive. Plugging it into his laptop, he revisited the files, hoping for a clue to turn the tide in their favor. One document stood out, a detailed map with marked locations. It wasn't just about weapons. The Razor Riders were part of a larger operation involving high-level trafficking routes. More troubling, the map included coordinates tied to local law enforcement offices. Jack clenched his jaw. Corruption ran deeper than he had imagined. Before he could dig further, a loud crash outside jolted him to attention. He peered through the window and spotted two bikers dismounting their motorcycles, flashlights cutting through the dark. "They're closing in," Jack muttered, grabbing his shotgun and positioning himself near the barricade. Duke stirred, ears perking up at the noise. Despite his injuries, the dog tried to rise, but Jack gently placed a hand on his back. "Not this time, partner. I'll handle it." The bikers moved closer, their voices low but audible through the thin walls of the station. "He's got to be in here," one of them said. Jack steadied his breath, waiting for the right moment. As the first biker tried to force the door open, Jack kicked it hard, sending the man stumbling backward. The second biker raised his weapon, but Jack was faster, firing a warning shot that sent him diving for cover. The element of surprise gave Jack the upper hand, but he knew the rest of the gang wouldn't be far behind. Retreating deeper into the station, Jack regrouped with Duke. The dog, though weak, stood at his side, ready to defend if necessary. "They won't stop," Jack said, more to himself than anyone else. He looked at the USB drive, then at Duke, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. They couldn't stay here much longer, but they needed a plan. As the sound of more engines approached, Jack tightened his grip on his weapon and prepared for the next wave. This fight was far from over. The engines grew louder, rumbling like thunder in the stillness of the night. Jack crouched near the window, scanning the dark forest as headlights cut through the trees. More bikers were closing in, and he knew the flimsy barricades wouldn't hold for long. His mind raced as he formulated a plan. "We can't stay here, Duke," Jack muttered, glancing at his injured partner. The daimyo, though visibly tired, perked up at his name, his loyalty unwavering despite his wounds. Jack moved quickly, gathering the few supplies he had left. He tucked the USB drive into a waterproof case and secured it inside his jacket. If they got their hands on the information, the consequences would be catastrophic. As he packed, a sudden burst of gunfire shattered the silence, bullets tearing through the wooden walls. Jack instinctively dropped to the floor, shielding Duke with his body. "They're not playing around," he muttered, his jaw tightening. The gunfire paused, replaced by shouting from outside. "Turner, we know you're in there. You've got nowhere to run." It was Marcus's voice, dripping with overconfidence. Jack peered through a crack in the wall, spotting the gang's leader that's standing near a cluster of bikes. Around him, more men were positioning themselves, clearly ready for an assault. Jack's stomach churned. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but surrender wasn't an option. He turned to Duke, who was watching him intently. "We're going to have to fight our way out of this," Jack said, his voice steady but grim. Duke let out a soft growl as if to say he was ready. Despite the odds, Jack felt a surge of determination. He set up a diversion, rigging a gas canister near the entrance with a makeshift fuse. It wouldn't stop the gang, but it would buy them precious seconds to escape. The moment the gang breached the barricades, Jack ignited the fuse. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was loud enough to disorient the bikers. Smoke filled the air as Jack grabbed Duke and bolted through a back window, landing hard on the ground outside. Duke stumbled, but kept pace, his instincts driving him forward. They sprinted into the woods, the cover of darkness, their only ally. Behind them, chaos erupted as the bikers scrambled to regroup. Breathing heavily, Jack pushed deeper into the forest, his grip firm on Duke's harness. He knew they couldn't run forever, but they needed to put as much distance as possible between them and the gang. The USB drive felt heavy in his pocket, a reminder of what was at stake. Glancing back at the faint glow of the ranger station in flames, Jack set his jaw. The fight wasn't over, but he and Duke had survived another round. Now they just needed to figure out how to strike back. The forest was eerily silent as Jack and Duke pressed onward, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound breaking the stillness. Jack's breath came in steady bursts, his mind racing as he tried to calculate their next move. Duke limped beside him, his resolve evident despite his injuries. "We're almost there," Jack whispered. Though he wasn't entirely sure where there was, the only certainty was that they couldn't stop until they were safe. As the first light of dawn broke through the canopy, Jack spotted an old, dilapidated cabin nestled in the trees. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging under years of neglect, but it would provide cover. He guided Duke inside, helping him onto a dusty rug before securing the entrance. The cabin had clearly been untouched for years, but it was sturdy enough to serve as a temporary hideout. "Rest here for a bit, buddy," Jack said, kneeling beside Duke and giving him a reassuring pat. Jack pulled out the USB drive, his mind turning back to the files he'd seen. The map and list of names painted a clear picture of a massive operation involving the Razor Riders and their powerful allies. One name in particular, Brandon Knight, still lingered in his thoughts. Knight had been a trusted ally once, but his involvement with the gang suggested he'd turned rogue. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Knight was pulling the strings, and if they wanted to end this, they'd have to face him directly. The sound of rustling leaves outside snapped Jack out of his thoughts. He froze, hand instinctively moving to his weapon. Peering through a crack in the wall, he spotted a lone figure approaching the cabin. It wasn't one of the bikers. This person moved differently, cautiously, as if they were searching for someone. Jack gripped his gun tighter, waiting for the figure to come closer. When the person stepped into the clearing, Jack recognized the face immediately. It was Knight. Knight stopped a few feet from the cabin, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Jack, I know you're in there," he called out, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to talk." Jack didn't lower his guard. He stepped out of the shadows, his weapon trained on Knight. "Talk fast," Jack said, his tone cold. Knight took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "The Razor Riders are just pawns in a bigger game," he began. "And if you don't stop this, they'll destroy everything you've worked for." Jack didn't flinch, but his mind raced as he processed Knight's words. Could he be telling the truth? Or was this another layer of deception? Before he could respond, Knight added, "I can help you, but you need to trust me." Jack glanced back at Duke, who was watching the exchange intently. The dog's instincts had never failed him before. Turning back to Knight, Jack lowered his weapon slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. "You've got 5 minutes," he said. Whatever came next would determine the fate of everything they were fighting for. The story of Jack and Duke is more than just a life and death struggle between man and crime. It is a touching journey of friendship, loyalty, and courage. Despite facing countless challenges, from injuries to unforeseen dangers, they stood side by side, never giving up. The bond between Jack and Duke transcended everything, proving that with faith and determination, nothing is impossible to overcome. As the battle against the Razor Riders gang nears its end, we witness not only the triumph of bravery, but also the lesson in loyalty and the power of never giving up, no matter how tough the circumstances. But the story of Jack and Duke is not over. It is only the beginning of the new adventures. The secrets, the battles, and the challenges still await them. If you've been captivated by this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this story. Every subscription helps us bring you more exciting, inspiring, and unpredictable stories. Thank you for joining Jack and Duke on this journey. Stay tuned for what's coming next. The battle is far from over.